There's a really important thing that beginner videographers completely ignore, and it's leading to bad looking video and colour grading frustration. Now, I also ignored this for a long time, but after a lot of research, observation and practice, I finally cracked the code. And I feel like I unlocked a part of videography that's made me feel much more confident and my shots improved dramatically. So I'm going to share with you what I've learned so that by the time you finish watching this video, you'll have much more control over your camera and the way you want your image to look. So what's the thing? Well, I'll show you exactly what happened to me.
Welcome to Bone Town, a place where the fastest shutter wins. This is Sam. He's frustrated. Not just because he put on his hat before his poncho, or because he can't get his hand out of the Pringles tube. Not sponsored. But because he can't seem to find a clear explanation about exposure. This is all he could seem to find when searching the web.
This is how to expose. No. This is how to expose. ETTR, exposed to the right. 18% gray. One stop over. This town ain't big enough.
While these two boneheads were brawling, Sam had had enough.
Screw this.
And just as he was about to give up on the whole thing, he realized maybe they're both right.
When it comes to exposure, there's so many variables that can affect the image and the style, which means there can't just be one method of exposing. Plus, all cameras are different, so it's just about knowing which methods to use and when. And the more you know, the better equipped you are to handle any situation. So I want to make it super simple for you and as straightforward as possible by showing you the methods that I find most accurate, some monitoring features that really help, a secret tool that should definitely be in everybody's camera bag. I'm also going to show you how I approach exposing in a few different scenarios so that you get perfect exposure every time, no matter where you're filming. But first, you need to know this. Exposure is all about making sure your image is the correct brightness, not too dark, not too bright, and that we have a clean image with minimal grain or noise. The luminance or brightness of an image is measured on the IRE scale. 0 is pure black and 100 is pure white. Different colours and surfaces reflect light in different ways, so they show up as different values on the scale. We need to set our camera so that whatever we're filming, those values are in the right place. You'll hear people say expose for middle grey. What does that even mean? Well, middle grey, you guessed it, sits roughly in the middle of this scale, around 40% or 42 if we're filming in log profile. Most cameras are calibrated so that we get the most dynamic range and information either side of middle grey when our exposure meter reads 0 when pointing at middle grey. And I'm going to explain how to set this later. The reason why middle grey is so important is because it's in the middle of the range of skin tones. So setting your camera to expose for middle grey will mean your subject's skin tones will be the correct brightness. Now, I just want to clear something up quickly because you'll also hear people referring to middle grey as 18% grey. Then we've got all these different names for middle grey, but don't let that confuse you because that just means it reflects 18% of the light off that grey. All you need to remember is that middle grey is 42% on the IRE scale. Now, there are a bunch of different ways to adjust the actual exposure, either by changing the intensity of the light or using your camera settings. Now, I cover exactly how to add or remove stops of light in this video here. Make sure you watch that after watching this video so that you can put all this information into practice. Let's talk about this secret tool. I strongly recommend everybody to check out the link in the description and get yourself one of these because it's one of the most handy tools I own when it comes to videography. Now, it may seem a little bit expensive, but it's well worth it in my opinion because it's going to make sure that you get perfect colours and perfect exposure in every single shot. And here's how to use it. We're going to use some exposure monitoring tools within our camera or your camera monitor to help get perfect exposure along with this color checker. So you've got your subject in the frame and the light just the way you want it. Now go into the camera zebra settings menu and select base/range. Set the base level to 42 and the range to plus or minus 0.2. This will make your camera display zebra stripes over any areas of the image that sit between 41 and 44 IRE. Now hold up the grayscale part on the color checker where your subject is going to be positioned. You can't just put it anywhere because it needs to be where the lighting is going to hit the subject. So if I put it here, is going to be a completely different reading because there's no light there. We want to expose for me, and I'm where the light is. You also need to think about the direction and the angle that you're pointing this at too. This is the part of my face that we're trying to expose for. So I need to put it as close to that as possible. I can't point it away from the light because it's going to cast a shadow and we're going to get the wrong reading. Then all you need to do is adjust the camera's exposure in the preferred method until zebras appear on this middle grey chip. And as you can see, it shows up on the IRE scale at around 42% mark. If you don't have zebras, you could also use the spot meter on your camera and just drag the box over the grey chip and then adjust your camera exposure until it reads 0. And that is perfect exposure. Now, as you'll be able to see, my skin tones sit slightly higher than middle grey. Some people like to expose 1 or 2 stops over or expose to the right as far as they can without clipping the highlights, and that basically means getting it as bright as they can before you lose detail in the highlights. And that's meant to bring up the shadows a little bit more and make it so that you get less grain in the shadows. But I much prefer exposing perfectly at middle grey for 2 reasons. Because you're shifting the midpoint of your dynamic range of your camera, you're losing dynamic range. It can't add that extra stop in the highlights. And number 2, brighter isn't always better. You can lose detail and texture in the skin if it's too bright, and also the highlights can look a little bit plasticky and your skin goes a little bit odd. Instead, what a lot of filmmakers do where they can is bounce light off the ceiling, and that just raises those darker areas slightly. For example, I'll move this light here. I mean, I'm filming in a small space at the moment, so you have to be careful with where the light reflects off the white walls. But as you can see, it just gives a little bit more detail to areas that are in the shadows, as you can see. And they use this a lot in horror movies or night scenes where they want it to look dark, but you still want to see what's going on. Because if everything was black, you just wouldn't be able to see any detail. And raising the ISO of your camera or trying to bring up the brightness in post will add grain and noise into your footage, and it won't look very nice. So this is a great technique to keep things looking clean and your colours looking good. So here's a few things to think about when you're filming outdoors. Expose for what you can't control, like sunlight or natural light, for example. If we expose using the middle grey method, depending on where you're facing and how strong the sunlight is, you might overexpose your highlights and lose all that detail in the clouds or the sky. So in order to preserve the detail in the sky, what we need to do is bring the exposure down, which will then bring the subject into the darker range. But then we've got 2 options. If you can, use a bounce board or another light to bring the subject back into the exposure range. Or if you don't have access to a light or a bounce on set, we might just have to bite the bullet and accept that when the subject is the most important thing, the highlights may get blown out a bit, and we might just have to live with those clipped highlights as a trade-off. So we shouldn't be compromising the exposure of the subject to preserve the highlights. It's all a creative choice, it's up to you. There's also a balance between your camera settings and the lighting that you're using. Obviously, you can't just blast light onto your subject because that's going to wash them out for a start, be way too bright, and it's going to make them squint as well. It's not very nice having a really bright light in somebody's face. And another problem you're going to get is light's going to bounce off different surfaces and fill in light where you don't want to. So you've got to be careful with how bright you go with your lights. The lighting has to look natural, but it also needs to be bright enough so that you can use the correct aperture depending on the style that you need to go for. So at this point, you're probably wondering, what's with the cowboy theme? Well, honestly, I don't know either. But exposure is only one piece of the puzzle when it comes to cinematic shots. If you truly want a better image and more professional colours, you really need to combine it with the advice in this video, because it's going to take what you've just learned and give you much more natural colours. Now ain't that just pieces of bait?